Chapter 2. Reconnaissance Among the Nations. I was on a ridge above a settlement in the hill country when I noticed the pattern. The fallen below me were doing what fallen always did in a new settlement. One near the well, where the arguing happened. One near the shrine that had appeared within the first season. A flat stone with a carved figure nobody could quite explain. One moving between the tents, finding the cracks in individual families and pressing into them. I'd seen it 100 times, and I catalogued it and moved on. The patrols had all looked the same. Settlement after settlement, the same mud brick walls going up around clusters of tents. The same disputed wells. The same fallen embedded in the same positions. One near the point of conflict. One near whatever local shrine had appeared. One moving between families, personalizing the corruption. Efficient and identical, spreading across every new nation the way the nations themselves had spread from Shinar, taking root before anyone thought to stop them. The approach varied depending on which people you were watching. In Shem's eastern settlements, the fallen worked subtle. Shem's line still carried more memory of the true God than the others. A residue of Noah's faithfulness that thinned with each generation but hadn't disappeared. You couldn't introduce new worship from nothing in those towns. So the fallen twisted what was already there instead, a prayer to the God of Noah that slowly became a prayer to a God of rain. A sacrifice offered in gratitude that slowly became a sacrifice offered in fear. The drift was so gradual that the humans didn't notice it happening. And by the time I identified it, roots had already set. In Ham's southern settlements, the approach was faster. Less residue, less resistance, more willingness to adopt whatever the fallen offered. New shrines appeared within a season of a settlement forming. The carved figures multiplied. The corruption moved from whisper to ritual faster than I could document it. In Japheth's northern territories, the fallen had gone aggressive. The cold lands bred hard people, and the fallen exploited that hardness directly, pushing toward violence and territorial warfare between clans. I'd fought skirmishes in the north, driving fallen back from flashpoints where human anger was about to cross into blood. They were low-ranking, spread thin, testing boundaries rather than holding them. I could handle 2 or 3 at a time without trouble. But that was the problem. They were too easy. I'd been a warrior long enough to know that easy fights mean the real fight is somewhere else. When the enemy gives you small victories, it's because they want your attention on the small victories. I'd seen this pattern before the flood. Scattered resistance along the edges while the real corruption built in the center. In the places where humans gathered in numbers large enough that sin found its own momentum. The skirmishes were a distraction. The question was what they were distracting from. I found the answer in the river valley. The settlement there was larger than the others. A proper town forming in the flat land where the water ran slow and the soil was deep. Ham's descendants, mixed with some of Shem's who'd drifted south. 300 families, maybe more. A market, a gathering hall, a granary. The beginnings of a permanent settlement. I came in from the north on a routine pass and stopped on the ridge above them. 14 fallen. Not scattered through the population, but organized. 4 on the perimeter, 1 at each approach. 6 inside, stationed at specific locations, the market, the granary, the gathering hall, 2 prominent households, and the shrine. And 4 more in a tight cluster near the center of town, doing something I hadn't seen before. I watched them for a long time before I understood what I was looking at. The 4 in the center weren't just stationed there. They were linked. Lines of influence running between them, and from them outward to the 6 interior positions, and from those positions into the human activity around each one. The shrine fed a particular kind of fear. That fear fed the arguments at the market. The market conflicts fed hoarding at the granary. The hoarding fed power consolidation in the prominent households. The power consolidation fed the shrine again. A closed loop, each part driving the next. the whole thing turning on its own momentum without needing the fallen to push it constantly. If this model spread to every town on Earth, you wouldn't need another Babel. You'd have 100 self-running engines of corruption, each one buried too deep in ordinary life to recognize for what it was. My orders were to observe and report, and I was to move on. I didn't move on. I want to be clear about this because it matters later and because Michael brought it up. My orders were reconnaissance, survey, document, report. I wasn't authorized to engage 14 fallen, and I wasn't authorized to penetrate their perimeter for intelligence on an operation I didn't understand yet. I did it anyway. Not recklessness, not pride. I did it because everything I'd been reporting was missing the point. I'd been counting fallen and mapping positions, and the whole time I'd been describing individual fires while the enemy was building something that could burn everything. If I walked away and gave another routine report, Michael would have numbers and locations, and none of it would show him what was actually happening. So I went in. The perimeter fallen detected me almost immediately. 4 sentries means they're protecting something worth protecting, and anything worth protecting gets watched carefully. The nearest one turned toward me, and I saw recognition in his face. Not of me personally, but of what I was, a lone angel approaching a defended position. He didn't attack. He signaled. 2 of the interior fallen peeled off their stations and moved to reinforce. 6 against 1, and I could have retreated, probably should have, but I needed more. I hit the perimeter at its weakest point, the gap between the south and west sentries, and I hit it hard. Not to fight through, but to read the response. When you strike a formation, how they react tells you as much as the formation itself. Which positions hold, and which shift, and where does the coordination break? The south sentry held. The west one shifted to close the gap, pulling one of the reinforcements with him. That left an opening on the east side that lasted maybe 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. I broke through on the east edge and got close enough to the central cluster to see the structure clearly. 4 fallen in a square, each facing outward, each running influence toward a different part of the settlement. But the lines didn't just go outward, they connected back. Between the 4 of them, a web that linked every corrupted element in the town into one system. I had what I needed. They hit me before I could pull back. 3 of them, from angles I should have anticipated but didn't because I was too focused on what I was seeing. The first caught my left side and drove me hard. The second came from above. The third aimed to pin me against the perimeter. I fought my way out, and it cost me. The one who hit my left side was one of the central cluster, stronger than the perimeter sentries, and his blade carried a cold that I felt for days after. I took a wound along my left arm and lost ground before I found an opening to break free. I came out on the west edge, moving fast, bleeding light from the arm wound. 2 of them pursued before breaking off. They didn't want to leave their formation undefended for long. I stopped in the hills above the settlement and pressed my hand against the wound. 14 fallen, 1 wounded angel with intelligence nobody else had. Getting to the upper regions took longer than it should have. The earthbound effect, the veterans had told me. The longer you serve on Earth, the harder it is to leave. The weight accumulates in your being, and the climb away from the surface becomes harder than it has any right to be. I'd served since creation. By now the pull of Earth was a real drag, like wading uphill against a current that wanted me to stay. The first thing that changed when I finally cleared it was the sound. Earth is loud. Not just the human noise, but the ground itself, a low, constant hum you stop hearing until it's gone. And the spiritual noise underneath that? The pressure of human choices pushing against each other, the weight of corruption in the land. All of it pressing on your senses until you stop noticing it the way you stop noticing a smell you've lived with too long. Up here, none of that. Just silence and space and the cold, clean light of stars that had never seen anything die. I'd forgotten how much I missed it. There were other angels at the staging post, dozens of them moving through on various assignments. The ones who had never served on Earth looked at me with that particular kind of awareness that I'd been seeing more often. Not contempt. Quieter than that. The look you give a man who's come in from a long winter, and you can see it in how he carries himself even after he's warmed up. They were clean. Their light ran clear and even without interruption. Mine had texture to it by now, grain pressed into it by centuries of Earth. The marks of every battle and every death I'd witnessed. And prayers rising from tents in the dark. I didn't mind it. But I noticed the difference. And they noticed it too. And neither side said anything because there wasn't anything to say. The staging post wasn't quiet. Not upper regions quiet, not the deep silence I'd been expecting. There was movement at the edges, angels arriving and departing faster than they should have been. The kind of purposeful urgency that meant someone somewhere had made a decision. I'd seen it before major engagements. The sense of a campaign shifting before anyone had been told what it meant. Michael arrived the way he always did. Without announcement, already moving. He stopped in front of me and I could tell from the set of his jaw that he already knew something was wrong. "Report," he said. "I broke from the assigned route," I said. Michael's silence had different textures. This one was the kind that came before either commendation or discipline, and I couldn't tell which. I described the river valley, the formation, and the 14 fallen. I described the closed loop of corruption running through every part of the settlement's life. How the individual elements fed each other without needing constant intervention. And how something like this, replicated across every village and town, would spread faster than anything we could track. Michael listened without interrupting. When I finished, the silence stretched longer than any pause I'd experienced in his presence. "You engaged them," he said. Not a question. "I had to get inside the perimeter to see the structure," I said. The survey distance wasn't enough. "You were outnumbered and unsupported." "Wounded." "Yes," I said. "You left your assigned route," Michael said. "You engaged a superior force without authorization. You risked yourself and everything you'd gathered over months of work." He held my gaze. "If they'd taken you, we'd have lost the intelligence and the angel who gathered it." I waited, and I didn't have a better answer than the one I'd already given. "You were wrong to go in alone," Michael said. "That's not a matter of outcome. The decision itself was wrong." "I know," I said. Michael looked at my arm, where the wound still carried the cold trace of a fallen blade. Then he looked at my face, and his jaw eased. "And you brought back the only intelligence that changes our strategy," he said. I didn't answer. "We've had fragments," Michael said. "Isolated reports suggesting coordination, but nothing showing the full picture. Nothing that explained why the corruption has been spreading faster than individual fallen could manage on their own." He paused. "Your report does." He was quiet, working through the implications. I waited and watched him think, and Michael rarely let you see that. He was usually 10 steps ahead of any conversation before it started. This time I'd given him genuinely new intelligence, and he was taking his time with it. Then Michael did something I'd never seen him do. He sat down. Not on anything. There's nothing to sit on in the deep space between star systems. But he settled, as if the weight of what I'd told him required a different posture than standing. "They learned from Babel," I said. "Yes," Michael said. "They can't build one tower, so they're building the pattern into every settlement. Scatter the people, scatter with them, rebuild the same structure everywhere. Smaller, harder to see, harder to fight, because there's no single place to strike." He looked at me. Every village becomes self-sustaining, and every village that runs the pattern teaches the neighboring villages by example, whether anyone intends it or not. Can we break it? I asked. We can break individual loops, Michael said. Remove the central cluster from a settlement, and the system falls apart. The interior fallen are still there, but working on their own, and corruption on its own moves slower. He paused. The problem is scale. There are more of those settlements than we have warriors to cover them. So we're losing, I said. Michael looked at me steadily. We're behind, he said. That's different. He paused. Your reports for the past months described the symptoms. This is the disease. That landed harder than the fallen's blade. Months of faithful, detailed, useless reporting. Months of following orders precisely while the real war happened underneath my survey grid. Your method was wrong, Michael said. But the instinct behind it, seeing what the routine misses, acting on it when the situation demands it, that's rare. Don't waste it on recklessness. It was the closest thing to praise Michael had ever given me, and it came wrapped in a correction, which was the most Michael thing I could have imagined. There's something else, Michael said. The reason I called you back, it isn't just the formation report. I waited. The seed line, Michael said. You know where it's reached? I've been watching it for years, I said. It's reached a man named Terah, Michael said. Terah has settled in Ur. He has 3 sons, and one of them is named Abram. What about him? I asked. Michael looked past me, toward the distant point of light that was Earth's sun. Small, unremarkable among billions. God is going to call him, Michael said. The words sat in the silence of deep space, with no noise to compete with them. Call him to what? I asked. Out, Michael said. Out of Ur, out of his father's household, and out of everything he knows. One man, I said. One man. Michael agreed. I heard the disbelief in my own voice, the shape of every time God moved in a way I didn't expect. One garden, one family on an ark. One language shattered into dozens. And now one man called out of a city that prayed to gods made of stone. I need you in Ur, Michael said. Not surveying, but watching one man and his family and protecting the seed line. How long? I asked. As long as it takes, Michael said. I looked out at the upper regions, the clean light, and the silence. I'd been away from Earth long enough that the weight was already lifting, my light starting to clear, the centuries of accumulated texture beginning to smooth out, and I was starting to remember what it had been like before the earthbound effect had pressed itself into me. If I went back, all of it would return, the noise, the weight, and the slow marking that came with watching human choices go wrong year after year and not being able to stop most of it. And this time, it wouldn't be a general patrol across 100 settlements. It would be personal, one man, one family. Decades of watching a single human life unfold, close enough to see every choice clearly, bound by the same constraints as always. I'll go, I said. I know, Michael said. Then, before I could leave, the fallen know about Terah's family. They don't know about the call yet, but they're tracking Shem's line the same way we are. When God speaks to Abram, they'll converge. I'll be ready, I said. The one commanding their operations in that region is Sariel, Michael said. The name stopped me. Sariel. I'd served under him before the rebellion, back when his name meant something clean, back when what he was matched, what he was called. He'd been the one who saw patterns before anyone else, who built systems where others built walls. Brilliant, once in service of God. You know him, Michael said. I knew who he was, I said. Before. The formation you found in the river valley, Michael said. That's his design. Of course it was. He'll be patient and subtle, Michael said. And he'll be watching you as carefully as you're watching Abram. I found Azel on the way down. He was stationed at the boundary between the northern territories and the eastern routes, a crossover point where two of the scattered people's lands touched. I hadn't expected to find him there. The war puts you where it puts you, Kemuel, Azel said when he saw me. He looked the same, steady and watchful, wearing the weight of earth without showing it, which wasn't the same as not feeling it. I hadn't seen him since Babel, since I'd watched him head north while I headed east, and neither of us had said much about it because we'd been watching over each other's shoulders since before the world existed, and neither of us knew how to mark the distance. We stood on the ridge together looking out over the land. Smoke from cook fires in a dozen settlements below. Children's voices on the wind. I've been reassigned, I said. One man, long term. The seed line? Azel said. Michael says God is going to call him out, I said. Out of out of everything. Azel was quiet for a moment. One man, he said. Same tone I'd used with Michael. I know, I said. After all of this, he looked out over the settlements below. All the nations. All the scattering. And God narrows it to one man in one city. That seems to be how he works, I said. Azel shook his head slowly, not in disagreement. More like a man who'd made peace with being surprised and hadn't quite managed it. You look different, he said. How? I said. Warn? Azel said. Earth is marking you. It marks all of us, I said. Not the same, Azel said. You carry it differently. Like you've let it in instead of holding it at the surface. I didn't answer right away. I thought about whether he was right. About whether letting the weight in was weakness or just what happened to angels who stayed long enough. The ones who'd never served on Earth had clean light and unmarked beings. And I'd been looking at them in the upper regions the same way they'd been looking at me. Are you still certain they're not worth it? I asked. The humans. Azel's jaw tightened. I'm certain they keep failing, he said. That's not the same thing. No, I agreed. It isn't. We didn't say goodbye, and we'd never been good at goodbyes. He nodded once. I nodded back, and I continued south toward while he stayed on the ridge watching the settlements below. The fallen were thicker the closer I got to I could feel them in the air, a pressure that built the way smoke builds before a fire, dense enough that moving through it took real effort. The city appeared on the horizon as a smudge of dust and haze, and above it, the ziggurat, a stepped tower rising over everything, its summit crowned with a temple to a god that didn't exist. The humans climbed those steps every day, carrying offerings, whispering prayers, pouring out devotion to carved stone while the fallen who had shaped those carvings fed on worship that was never meant for them. I could see Sariel's work everywhere, not his presence, not yet, but his design. The same closed-loop pattern from the river valley, scaled up for a city. The market running fear through every argument over price and debt. The ziggurat converting that fear into religious obligation. The priests, mostly serving a fallen who never showed himself but stood just behind each ceremony, fed on the worship and directed it back into more fear. The whole city turning on its own momentum, generation after generation, requiring less and less intervention the longer it ran. I hated that I could see how well it worked. I took my position above Tara's household and started mapping the fallen presence. What I found made me stop. One of them was already watching me. Not attacking, not signaling. Just watching from a position above the market that gave him a clean line of sight to where I'd stopped. He was low-ranking, not one of the central cluster, a sentry, which meant I'd been clocked the moment I entered the city. And Sariel already knew I was here. I held my position and looked back at him. He didn't move, and neither did I. After a long moment, he turned away, deliberately, the way you turn away from a target you've already reported and no longer need to watch. That was worse than an attack. I found Tara's household by following the seed line. That faint trace of faithfulness running through Shem's descendants, showing itself in small ways. A prayer offered in the old tongue before a meal, low enough that the neighbors wouldn't hear. A reluctance to climb the ziggurat steps on the feast days, finding reasons to be elsewhere. A story told to children at night about a God who made the stars and drowned a world and set a rainbow in the sky. The story had changed with the generations, details shifting, some things added that weren't quite right. But the core of it was still there. God real, God present, God remembering. Tara carried the trace, faintly and imperfectly. He'd lived in this city his whole life, and he hadn't bowed to the ziggurat. But he hadn't resisted with any particular force either. A man holding onto a thread without quite knowing why. Passing it down to his sons without knowing what it would become. I found Abram in the market. He was buying grain, arguing cheerfully with a merchant over the price. Nothing about him would have caught my attention if I hadn't been sent to find him specifically. Average height, the build of a man who worked with his hands, but not exceptionally. A face that was weathered from sun and time, unremarkable, the kind of face that doesn't perform anything. He was laughing at a joke the merchant made. Even as he pushed back on the price, he was laughing. There was an ease in him. The ease of a man who was mostly at peace with his life even when his life isn't everything he wanted. I knew about the barrenness, and everyone in the market knew. His wife, Sarai, drew a particular kind of pity from the other women, the careful, sidelong kind that people offer when they believe someone is cursed and don't want to get too close to it. Abram didn't seem to carry that as heavily as he might have. Or maybe he carried it in private and kept it off his face in public. I didn't know him yet, and I was just beginning to watch. One man. This man. God's answer to Sariel's formations, spreading through every nation on earth. I'd been saying I didn't understand since God shaped the first figure from dust and breathed into it. I'd keep saying it because it kept being true. But every time, the thing I didn't understand turned out to matter most. So I settled in. Found my position above Tara's household, above the market where Abram was still haggling with the merchant, above the city with its ziggurat pointing at a heaven it would never touch. I began the long work of watching one ordinary man live one ordinary life. The sentry I'd spotted above the market was still there. Still watching, Sariel already knew I'd arrived, and I'd barely begun.
Chapter Guild, Stories for Your Mind.